So how does one explain the IMF's outlook for the world and India for 2021-22? At the moment, joining me now is the chief economist at the IMF, Dr. Gita Gopinath. Always a pleasure to have you, Dr. Gopinath, on the show. Let me turn to the concern first in India, because the IMF has slashed India's projected growth rate for 21-22 from 12.5% in April now to 9.5%. Does that in a way suggest that in extraordinary times you're just not able to predict what comes next? We had the second wave in March to May, and that seems to have sent all the numbers into a tizzy.
Hi, Rajdeep. Always a pleasure to talk to you. So if you recall, when I did the projections in April, I had warned that there were downside risks to our forecast because we were just seeing the start of the second wave in India. And while we had assumed that there would be localized lockdowns, the lockdowns became far more widespread. There were statewide lockdowns. And so that's the reason why we have a downgrade of 3 percentage points. And also coming out of it, the recovery is modest because, again, there are still headwinds there. I mean, there could be, the pandemic is not over, there could be another surge. So keeping all of that in mind, we have a fairly modest recovery for this year.
No, I'm sorry to sound skeptical, but does that mean that, even now, these numbers could go into a tizzy should there be, God forbid, another wave or an increase in the number of corona cases in India? So in that sense, is it becoming much more difficult to give any forecast with any kind of certainty because of the number of X factors here?
Rajiv, we're living in incredibly uncertain times, and we have a pandemic, a virus that's determining the course of economies. So there is a lot of uncertainty here. But again, it still is the case that India had a very deep recession last year, and we're seeing the kind of growth numbers that we're seeing right now. It tells you something about the gap, the distance that still needs to be traveled. So for instance, even by the end of this year, India is still around 8 to 10% below where we would have projected it would have been in the absence of this pandemic. So these numbers give you at least a ballpark estimate of the kinds of gaps that need to be closed and therefore what kinds of policy actions are needed.
No, the reason I'm asking you this, and I'm sorry to press you on this for a moment, is just that the growth projection in the last 3 years seem to be going all right because so much else seems to be happening around us at the moment. So can we say with any certainty that come December, January, these projections that India will witness an upsurge to 9.5%, which is your latest predictions, can actually come true? They could go horribly wrong, couldn't they, if there is a third wave?
Once again, I agree with you that there is a lot of uncertainty. But Rajdeep, let's compare the numbers here. We had 12.5% in April, and we're down to 9.5. I think there were people who thought that number would come down all the way to 2 or 3%. So there are adjustments that are being made. There's tremendous uncertainty. There's, epidemiological models that try to predict where the next wave will be, have a huge band of uncertainty. But again, like I said, in terms of a ballpark estimate, these are good guiding numbers.
So you still remain convinced that the economy, in a sense, is on the path to recovery, or is it only in really comparison to what was the situation pre-March, that's pre-March 2020, pre-COVID 2020? So in a sense, when you look at the numbers in the larger context, the economy is still nowhere near where it needs to be.
So the recovery that we have right now indeed comes back after a very deep recession, so a negative 7.3% for last year. And then there's a return to some kind of normalcy. But, if you keep in mind that India on average tends to grow at around 5 to 6% on an annual basis, there is still a big gap in terms of where India where India should have been in the absence of the pandemic. And you can see this in employment numbers. I mean, after the most recent wave, you see unemployment rates go up. But it's not just the unemployment rates. I'm also worried about the labor force participation rates, which is if you see the number of people who are even actively looking for work, that number has come down, significantly. And so those are the gaps that still remain. So again, when you have large base effects, you're going to see very large numbers. And let me show you, for instance, the quarterly reading that's going to come for India for April through April, May, June. That particular quarter is going to show some very blockbuster numbers. But again, that's keeping in mind that there was about a 24% decline last year around the same time. So these numbers have to be kept in perspective.
So everything isn't really in comparison to what it was in 2020. Let me, one of the interesting aspects of your survey seems to suggest that the countries that are vaccinated faster are the ones where your growth projections are higher. The US up by 0.6%. You're revising your growth projections for UK by 1.7%. So the worry is the world, and that seems to be one of the reasons why you're worried about India, the slow pace of vaccination. So is the world getting divided, according to the IMF, by countries that are vaccinating faster, so better chances of growth or better chance of coping with the pandemic, and those who are struggling with the aftershocks of the pandemic because vaccination levels are slower?
Vaccinations are a very important factor behind this divide that we're seeing in terms of some countries coming back very strongly while others are setting weak to modest recoveries and many falling behind. So we have the advanced economies where on average 40% of their population has been fully vaccinated. That number is 11% in emerging markets. And when you go down to low-income countries, for instance, in Africa, it's less than 2%. So we have this big difference. And we know that for many economies, the service sector is a big engine of growth. And when you're not able to engage in activities in the service sector and you cannot have contact-intensive activities, go to restaurants and so on, travel, tourism, then that poses an important problem. In the case of India, I mean, we should, it is a good sign that we're seeing vaccinations at around 4 million people a day, which if that pace is maintained till the end of this calendar year, that would be a coverage of around 38% of the population being fully vaccinated. That is much better than one would have thought of in January or in those early months. So there is pickup. But again, that's the area where a lot more can be done in terms of kind of accelerating, especially towards the end of the year when you're going to get more and more vaccines available.
No, the reason I'm asking you this is that you're seeing in the United States a resurgence of the Delta variant, cases up again. You're seeing a bit of that in the UK as well. I'm just wondering, with the world still oscillating from the aftershocks, one possible wave after the other, I come back to it, Dr. Gopinath, is anything predictable anymore? Can you really give any of these growth projections with any kind of certainty, or how much of this is based on the concept of hope and optimism, both at the fund as well as in industry?
So, Rajdeep, I think that, we shouldn't get all flustered over here. Let's keep in mind that the vaccines still work. When it comes to severe disease, when it comes to hospitalizations and deaths, the vaccines work against all the variants we know so far. So yes, cases have gone up, and you saw that go up really sharply in the UK, despite having close to 70% get one dose. You've seen cases go up by a lot, and of course they're coming down. They're actually coming down fairly rapidly now in the UK. But if you look at hospitalizations, they went up some, but not much. So that's a good, if we can get that in all parts of the world, that is a good place to be. So again, getting in the US, it's only about 50% of the population that's fully vaccinated. So there's a big chunk that's unvaccinated, and you're going to see cases going up. Mm-hmm. But given that the high-risk population, the adult populations have been vaccinated, at least in terms of hospitalizations and deaths, we are not seeing the same pattern. So it's not the same cycle repeating itself every single time. Mm-hmm. This time we're seeing waves, but we're not seeing big increases in hospitalizations, again, in parts of the world where there's sufficient vaccine coverage. So I think there is a hope of getting out of this tunnel, but we really have to get to widespread vaccinations. Otherwise, there can be some new variant, and we will be having a completely different conversation next time around.
As we come to the end of this, I just want to come back to where we started. There is a belief that the IMF is talking up the Indian economy when the reality is very different. I meet people on the ground who say, look at how we are suffering. Jobs are down, incomes are down. We are having to close down small businesses. And you tell us, as the IMF did in April, that we are going to get into double-digit growth. There is this alternate reality being created. The reality on the ground is different. What will you tell them? That, is there a huge mismatch between the reality and the hope?
I'll make a couple of points, Rajdeep. Firstly, I think when people read the numbers, they really do have to put it in the context of a very deep recession last year, mm-hmm. A historically deep recession in India. So when you add the numbers together, when you kind of look at what's happened cumulatively over 2 years, I would say that, there is some recovery, but there is a long way to go. So it's not incongruous that on one hand you have a lot of people who think that they've been very hard hit and the numbers, because there is indeed, like I said, a huge gap between where India should have been in the absence of the pandemic and where it is now. So please, keep that in context. And a lot more needs to be done in terms of policies and in terms of addressing the weaknesses in the different sectors. The second part I would point out is the fact that, yes, there's some things that don't show up in the GDP numbers. For instance, the informal sector, just much harder to measure, and they are getting harder hit. There's extreme poverty. There's distributional consequences. I mean, the stock market is booming, but then there are MSMEs that are in very bad shape. So there are all these distributional aspects that also need to be taken into account when you want to get a full picture of how the economy is doing. So, those would be the 2 points I'd make.
In 1 minute, if I were to ask you 1, 2, 3, the 3 things that you want to see India do right away?
I would say first, provide additional support to low-income households. Second, would be to, is some more spending on the health sector and also for MSMEs. And I think it's very important for India to set out, and on education, I'm sorry, I missed that. And then I think it's very important for India to credibly communicate a medium-term fiscal consolidation strategy, which is one implement now. But it's a good signaling device of how they will get to lower levels of deficit. And that combination will help propel a stronger recovery.
Okay, final question, Dr. Gopinath. I'm going to record this 3 months from now when you come up with your next sort of outlook. Are you more optimistic than you are today? Or do you believe that there could still be those X factors? I repeat, the third wave, a slowing down of vaccinations or non-availability of vaccinations to certain parts of the world, including India. Are those worries, or do you believe the worst is over?
I think we're still in the period of uncertain events. There are some parts of the world where, given the amount of vaccination they have, I would say that the worst is behind, and we're in a better place. Again, as long as you do what needs to be done, we know that vaccinations work. We need to get many more shots in arm, and if we can do that in the next 6 months, then we are in a far more durable recovery, and we can put this behind us. But unfortunately, I don't control all the levers over here, so I just don't know where this will go.
Okay, I think that's fair enough. I think you are putting in enough safeguards this time and caveats, and I think that is important in the times in which we live. These are uncertain, extraordinary times. But I appreciate, Dr. Gopinath, the effort that you and the IMF are putting to give us this economic outlook, because it at least gives us a sense of where we stand at the moment. So thank you very much for joining me here on the news today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajdeep.